what do I mean when I use terms like plausible or implausible? Well, for the purposes of my research, I define implausibility as a plurality of things, or materials that a composer or an artist might use to create a work of art or a musical composition by taking these materials and interconnecting them in network relations. But these materials in the artwork or in the music composition are also differentiable, because we all know that we can analyze a work of art or a music composition in terms of its constituent parts. Now, individually, this material doesn't produce any disruption of human thought. That is, the goal-oriented flow of ideas and associations leading to all too human-oriented conclusions about reality, our comfortable notions about the way things are. But when considered together, suddenly this plurality of artistic material seems hardly likely to be true. And it does challenge human hypocrisy, and it does challenge human complacency. It's almost like an emergent quality, an emergent property, rather, of the total work of art, the total composition. And once again, this isn't generated by the components themselves, but by the seeming utter unlikelihood of the composite. Now, this isn't anything new in music history or art history. In Mahler's time, Gustav Mahler himself was accused of writing music that the people of his time found to be rather implausible. Just take the scathing invective against Mahler's music, for instance. So even to those whom it does not offend directly, it cannot possibly communicate anything. One does not have to be repelled by Mahler's artistic personality in order to realize the complete emptiness and vacuity of an art in which the spasm of an impotent mock titanism reduces itself to a frank gratification of common seamstress-like sentimentality. Oof. Anti-Anthropocentrism. In my paper, I give a rather detailed definition of anti-anthropocentrism, but for the purposes of this talk, let it suffice to say that anti-anthropocentrism is synonymous, in my paper at the very least, with implausibility. And so refers to music or art that general audiences, the average recipient, the average listener, would not prefer. Art or music that the average Joe recipient would find very disturbing or unsettling. Throughout the course of my research, I began to realize that there seemed to be a mutual dependence between two things. First, the composers or the artists' humanism. They can't escape being human. And their ostensibly anti-anthropocentric work that general audiences, average recipients would find to be implausible, largely because of the negative effects the artist or composer intended their work to have on an audience. Anyway, this mutual dependence between these two things can be theorized as a feedback loop, which I've done here. Using Gustav Mahler as an example, can you see where I'm pointing with that arrow? He certainly had the creative urge. And his creativity led him to compose. His composition led to the creation of works that the audiences of his time found to be really rather implausible. Why? Because of its extreme ambiguity, its superfluous length, its superfluous pathos. This implausibility goes a long way toward explaining why the audiences of his day found his music objectionable. They really did seem to resent it, and really reacted very negatively to it. But as we all know from the history of music and art, that this has a funny way of encouraging and or establishing the creativity of individual composers and artists, just like Gustav Mahler. Why? Because to him it serves as proof. Hey, it is possible to successfully challenge what is expected. Maybe I can successfully challenge what people find appropriate. Well, now that we've defined our term somewhat, let's turn our attention for a moment or two to 6 categories of anti-anthropocentrism in art and music I believe I've been able to identify, beginning with nihilistic anti-anthropocentrism. This form of anti-anthropocentrism in art consists of works by creators who have essentially shirked the problem of meaning altogether. And so it's a term that can be applied to phenomena such as the kind of art we've all seen and heard, art based on the absolute inversion of accepted moral standards. There's biotechnological anti-anthropocentrism. This art practice isn't just meant as a critique of the implications and outcomes of genetic technologies, but the creators of this kind of art, in their attempt to achieve this ambition, really seem to militate against accepted ethical standards. Just take transgenic art, for example, involving the transfer of genetic material to create hybrid organisms before releasing them into the environment. Thirdly, there's what I like to call ultra-terrestrial anthropocentrism, to borrow a term from journalist and parapsychologist John Keel. This has to do with the composers of the artist's engagement with cross-cultural, the fairy-type stories of archetypal beings. Think, for instance, of Claude Debussy's Sirène from his Nocturnes for Orchestra, or more recently, Susan Hiller's sound sculpture installation, Witness, from the year 2000, incorporating the testimonies of so-called alien abductees. Or you might think of Finnish composer Aino Juhani Rautavaara's orchestral work, Angels and Visitations from 1978. There's posthuman anti-anthropocentrism, which basically takes for granted the biological limitations of Homo sapiens, and so pertains to the composition of works that are humanly impossible to faithfully perform, execute, or even appreciate. Take, for instance, Georgi Ligeti's Etude number 14a, Kolonna Farshit, or Column Without End, which is a work that's simply too fast for any human to play. Or there's a group called Bull of Heaven. They composed a work that is significantly longer than any human performer's lifespan. There's high technological anti-anthropocentrism, which, as you might guess, has to do with the movement of artificial intelligence into the domain of human creativity, understood as the machine synthesis of inputs to generate original works of art, original works of music by means of automated, algorithm-driven processes. But where I spent most of my ink in this paper is on the 6th category, psychological anti-anthropocentrism, which refers to the equivalence between all that is anti-anthropocentric on the one hand and everything the conscious human ego refuses to identify itself. You know, we all tend to reject, we tend to choose to remain ignorant of whatever we find objectionable. In fact, anything that challenges whatever we find acceptable is something we tend to view very negatively. It's the unknown, humanity's greatest fear, and so we insulate ourselves by constantly raising the shield of illusion between the ego and the real world. So in one very real sense, the anti-anthropocentric is roughly equivalent to Carl Jung's shadow archetype. In spite of this, or perhaps even because of it, the anti-anthropocentric, like the shadow, may in fact be a latent source of potent creativity. Consequently, the most interesting anti-anthropocentrism may be one's own. Take, for example, my own work, H&H, which by virtue of this feedback loop, cybernetic behavior, evokes this cosmic inhospitableness, because we all know the universe really doesn't care about us at all. And so, like all other instances of anti-anthropocentrism or implausibility in art, can be considered as emblematic of the inverse instantiation of classical humanism. Or we can think of it another way, as the negative space around and between it and classical humanism. Or we might take it a step further and say analogically speaking, that it is the shadow of classical humanism. Speaking of H&H, let's look at that just a little more intently. H&H is an anti-anthropocentric composition pedagogical device that juxtaposes this anachronistic, humanistic, conventional type of music for which the piano is a metaphor, with an anti-humanism associated with an ever-present techno-scientific digital delay effect. Each of the composition's 11 movements denotes a stage and a process meant to gradually eliminate the gap between the human and non-human, or to state it conversely, to increase the sense of a single identity shared by both. Now, with each movement, I'm constantly updating the variables of that movement, delay time, sine wave modulation, etc., etc. And the reason I do that is to, well, it's part of the process. I'm incrementally unveiling a more and more unconventional, non-human music, according to typical feedback loop action, as you can see in the diagram. Now, I wanted to take the operative logic of the feedback loop and display it as a self-referential system. And so here you can see all the individual parameters of each movement feeding into the next movement, and so on and so forth. You can think of it this way. Each movement is the input, okay, for the next output, which is the subsequent movement. And this continues until the final and 11th movement, or piece. Then I got to thinking, is it possible that a work like The Human and Non-Human, H&H, and other works of art, compositions that could be termed anti-anthropocentric or implausible, is it possible that these are just externalizations of a greater meta sort of feedback loop that would serve the purpose of an attractor, not in the strict mathematical sense, but one that would nonetheless symbolize the tendency toward anti-anthropocentrism in art and music. It would represent, at any given instant in an artwork, the shift toward and/or the appearance of events that seem deliberately contrary to what human beings normally prefer. And so here you can see in figure 4 that I've given a structural model of the anti-anthropocentric attractor. In cases of the hairiest, gnarliest, ugliest pieces of art and or music, the Joe percipient, the general audience, will at the very least be able to recognize, hey, there's an aesthetic framework here, right? There is, at the very least, they'll be able to recognize there's a musical framework going on here. But the degree to which they're able to understand the work is another matter, having to do with this meta feedback loop, the anti-anthropocentric attractor. Because the degree to which the artist or the composer has successfully bridged the gap between the negative effects that he or she intended the work to have and the successful execution or communication of those intentions. Depending on how successful the artist or the composer is at accomplishing this, the work itself will have a certain degree to which it cannot be understood, not humanly.